When the first 4 of the 7 seals are broken, 4 riders shall be summoned. Default font: cash grab, monkey, scam. These are the 4 horsemen of garbage games of 2023. The absolute most trash games of this year in a way that doesn't just make you think, oh, damn, that game must have had some issues along the way, but instead is straight up offensive to anyone who plays video games, just with the sheer and clear lack of actual passion or effort or even time really put into any of these projects. In a year that is this absolutely filled to the brim with incredible games. A year that had Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Baldur's Gate 3, just to name 2 exceptional entries that stand out even among a roster that includes some of the best games that have released in years, and yet we somehow managed to, in this same year, get 4 of the worst excuses for a video game ever put out to market. So today we're going to talk about all 4 of these games, their stories, and why they have become incredible tutorials on what not to do when making video games. In a world as beloved as Tolkien's Middle-earth, with so many exceptional existing characters and backstories to go from that have never been brought to video gaming as a medium, one development team chose the one character every person on this planet thought would be perfect to play as in a story-focused adventure game: Gollum. Smeagol? The line is thin, and this is sort of the crux of the game. That said, as interesting a choice as that isn't what made the game what it is now, because if that was done right, an abstract idea like that could be made into an amazing piece of media to consume, a piece of art even, but when done wrong, it feels like an absolute joke. And when you understand what happened with the game, the joke seems to unfortunately have been played on the developers about as much as the players. Not the big boss, of course, but the people that were asked to make a game they weren't equipped to make. Before this point in time, before this specific game, Daedalic, the developers, were mostly responsible for point-and-click adventure games, with a number of them actually being received reasonably well. Then in 2019, they had acquired the rights to make a Lord of the Rings game focused on Gollum, without any real explanation as to why they'd gone for that. And then the team that up until this point had focused on point-and-click adventures was then forced to create a full-fledged action-adventure game with the branding of the Lord of the Rings, again, for some strange reason, focused on Gollum. I still can't believe that choice in the first place, but essentially, this realistically comes down to the choices of the CEO of the company and anyone who he was advised on by on the matter. Because what happened is he took a very big but abstract idea, went for the purchasing of the rights of it, requiring a whole genre shift for his team from anything that they had worked on up until that point, and said, we're gonna do this, we have to do this, let's get it done. And so they did. They made the game. It took them 4 years from the first announcement of them acquiring the licensing rights, and this game is the result of doing that with a team of less than 100 people, more than anything else. The gameplay itself is extremely bland, basically just running, jumping, climbing, because, well, you play as Gollum, and Gollum survives by escaping, not by fighting, so it's more of a stealth adventure game than anything, and in itself, it could make an interesting basis for a game if the rest of it is done right, but again, it just feels so bland. It doesn't really do anything innovative in the space. It just feels like a very poor vehicle for the storytelling. Now, with that said, if the storytelling was impeccable, then that would still somewhat work right. It wouldn't be a great game, but it would at least be a functional game that would be acceptable. There would be plenty of people who just love The Lord of the Rings as a concept and would be willing to put up with mediocre gameplay just to experience a solid story in the world. But here's the thing. In an interview up to 2 years before release, the game director said that they had done dialogue choices in an interesting way, a new way, a refreshing way, playing up the pull between Gollum and Smeagol as a sort of light side, dark side mechanic, tying all types of different mini-games to your ability to even choose between the different dialogue options based on how hard it would be for Gollum to fight against his darkest urges and continue to actually be Smeagol as much as he can. Then the game came out, and it was again just this really bland, here's some text, choose between the options, nothing special, and it even goes as far as to use the most default-ass font in the Lord of the Rings, of all things, something with very characteristic fonts, and that's incredible. And the thing is, pretty much leading up until release, the company in charge of the licensing for Lord of the Rings, the company that gave this to Daedalic to create this masterpiece, was fully on board, saying that they had plans to work on more Lord of the Rings games with them after this project, saying, quote, "Gentlemen, we do not stop until it's dead. But what if we make the game shit? You've already made a shit game. We've had one, yes, but what about an even shittier game? That was not a real quote, of course, but it should be because it's the truth. In any case, that second game is not in the process of being made, and it never will be. And the reason why, within 30 days of releasing Lord of the Rings Gollum, it universally was panned by critics and players alike, and so Daedalic made the decision to shut down its entire development department and focus purely on publishing games. In other words, the CEO of the company bought rights to something, told a team that was far too small to create a game in a completely different genre to their normal style, provided nowhere near enough resources for them to do it properly, then released the game, knowing exactly how it would be received, but hoping to recoup some of the losses from a 4-year development cycle. I'd say they knew how it would be received before releasing it, because it was, again, less than 1 month after its release that the development department was shut down. That wasn't a quick spur-of-the-moment decision. That's something they knew they were going to do before the game had even released, and then they released it anyways, essentially pushing the results of their own bad decisions onto us and trying to drain a bit of money from potential players to make up for their own mistakes making the game, charging $50 at launch, which in itself is insane. This is an absolute tragedy because there is a world in which a game with this concept done actually properly could have been a surprisingly lovely experience, but what we got was a strange concept executed extremely poorly due to mismanagement and arguably even a bad choice to put their people in this situation to begin with. Not to mention, as if some full-on admittance of the terrible practices on display, they even released this apology message about the underwhelming experience many of us have had with the Lord of Ring Gollum. Yeah, in case you hadn't worked it out, this apology was written by an AI. Keep in mind, all this went down a number of months ago. The game released in May, the studio shut down the department in June, and then a little bit of time passed with most of the video game community being fully aware about this game, and then it had come out as a steaming pile of crap, relatively convinced that nothing could possibly beat it out for worst game of the year, even only halfway through the year, as this was arguably the worst game that's been ever released in the past few years, not even just this time period. And so we were all pretty confident it couldn't be topped, or bottomed, I suppose.
What are you, an idiot?
Then came July, and with it came some photos that were leaked for a game by the name of Skull Island Rise of Kong. Just look at them. This is the peak of graphics, ladies and gentlemen, and here we of course have another licensed franchise game, and you may be saying, oh, well, maybe those screenshots don't tell a fair story. Maybe it looks better in motion, maybe they're from a stage of the game development before it was ready to actually be shown to people. Well, literally the day after the screenshot leaks, they gave us their actual announcement trailer released properly, which looked exactly like the screenshots but in motion, which somehow made it look even worse. And then on October 17th, the game was released to the public. Was it fixed? Was it upgraded? Well, you tell me, because you are looking at post-release gameplay from an actual player. There are a lot of times when commenting about a game that people will say it has PlayStation 2 graphics as a sort of exaggerated jab, but this game literally looks like it should have been released on the PlayStation 2. Not even just the graphics, the UI, the animations, all of it. Not to mention the combat itself. I mean, let's be real. This game is supposed to be a fun power fantasy where you get to play as a giant monkey beating up dinosaurs and all kinds of various giant beasts to climb your way to be the king himself of the island. So if the combat actually did feel good, there could still be a decent game here, even if it had atrocious visuals like it does, but that's not the case. I mean, look at this. What is essentially an early boss fight. The controls are basically move or punch, and the enemy isn't even really fighting back. The AI is clearly very poorly made, and it just looks absolutely awful. Like, I could totally believe this was originally made as a mobile game, and they just widened out the screen and scaled it up. This one doesn't have as much of a disastrous development cycle history to follow, as we didn't even know it existed until a handful of months before release, so we can't really blame this on the producer pressure or anything like that, though it's worth mentioning the producer of this project is literally called Game Mill, so, you know, that might give pause to begin with. Not that I'm implying anything going on here.
Tell them the studio pressured us into an early departure. What are they gonna do, sue me? Huh?
And yet, if you look at their history, it isn't exactly bright and shiny. The development studio for this game, Iguanabee, has definitely a bit more of a checkered past as well, with most of their recent games being licensed products, and most of them not being received very well either. But this game is exceptional even among that for just how bad it actually is. The Gollum game, for everything that you can say about it, is a story game first and foremost. Now, that story isn't good by any means, and it is surrounded by even hotter garbage of an actual game, but you can argue there is at least the story there to consume as actual media. Skull Island Rise of Kong is not a story-focused game. game. It is a combat-focused game, a power fantasy-focused game, a game that wants you to enjoy the combat as its main goal, and yet what they actually presented is a game that looks absolutely horrible, and somehow manages to play at least as badly, with essentially no story behind any of it, selling itself on the combat experience of playing as King Kong, beating through the titans of the jungle, and then the in-game cutscenes look like this. How is this supposed to make you feel immersed in this world in any way? Unlike Gollum, this at least released with a price that acknowledged the game was not quite top tier, releasing on sale already at launch for $32 US, but after a few days reaching its non-sale price of $40. So, you know, still asking quite a lot of money for what the product actually is, and for something that pretty much everyone agrees is somehow even worse than Gollum, not from an overambitious concept, not from a team that had never done this style of game before, but simply because they just made a really, really bad video game, and then instead of shelving it or choosing to take more time to work out how to make it better or make it even proper in the first place, they decided, you know what, it's completely consumer ready, showing absolutely zero remorse for their actions, and released it once again just trying to get a bit of money recouped in exchange for something that is genuinely just trash. It is not worth the time to play, not to mention also requiring money to be spent to even get the chance to spend your time on it. The all-time peak players for this game was literally 22 on launch day. Do you realize how bad your game has to be to have only 22 people playing it simultaneously as your all-time peak? Even Gollum managed to reach over 700 on release, which is exponentially higher than 22. What more can be said about this really, as neither the developer nor publisher has had much to say post-release either. No attempt at an apology, just moving on to keep shoving grains through the game mill. At this point in the year, October now, we now have two of the absolute worst games that have released in the last few years, happening over the span of only a few months. Surely we must have reached the inverse peak of video gaming for now, right? The worst that could happen this year. Well, for the immediate moment, we were unsure, because of course in September, a game had been announced for late the year that was drumming up a good bit of concern. That game, The Walking Dead Destinies. As a concept, this was actually sort of interesting, but even the trailer made it look quite questionable to begin with because it just looked bad. The gameplay looked bad, the graphics looked bad, but what this is, what they were selling it as, is one of countless games based off the Walking Dead series, which of course gained massive popularity with the television show release, which for anyone wondering, started in 2010, so 13 years ago. Unlike most of the games set in this universe, this actually does follow the original story, the main cast, following it as accurately as it possibly can. But it comes with the interesting idea of letting you sort of rewrite the story yourself, making important choices that change where it actually goes from where it originally went, with the main one that they advertised ahead of time being, what if Shane had killed Rick instead of Rick killing Shane? How would that have changed the entire rest of the series? Well, that was quite hefty a promise, as anyone who has watched or read the series can attest, there are a lot of these types of key choices that you could technically change, and if you were to actually follow the different outcomes of each one realistically, you would wind up with thousands, if not millions, of branching potential paths. And so, as often happens in choice-based dialogue-driven video games, they oversold it entirely. But this time, they oversold it such an insane amount. By all accounts, the story barely changes at all with your decisions, with situations coming up where even if you kill a character off, a familiar line that you know that they would have said later on will still be said, just by a different character. If Shane kills Rick instead of Rick killing Shane, he essentially just becomes Rick. He fills his role, does his thing. The only real difference is that we, the audience, know the truth of what happened there. There's some different dialogue here and there, but it doesn't change the actual overarching story in a meaningful way at all, and that is the absolute nail to the coffin of this game. The graphics aren't great, sure, the characters look a bit like they're made of plastic in a world supposed to be driven by emotion, and the gameplay looks mediocre as hell, though somehow still better than Skull Island because at least there are actual animations involved that make it feel a little bit weightier than literally slapping the air. But then the cherry on top is that this game is supposed to be focused on the story. That's their selling point, being tons of divergent story paths on a story that people have known for years, a way of retelling it in a way that makes it exciting again. And the best thing about all of it is that the story doesn't really diverge at all, with them feeling the need to hit all the same major plot points because they think the audience is just a lost puppy dog that thinks they want to see a different story, but actually just wants to be spoon-fed the exact same thing all over again with different characters delivering the lines.
Carl? 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 Carl?
In the end, this one isn't really exceptional for any particular reason, it's just extremely mediocre, extremely bad, and the third example of a licensed game coming out this year that feels like it was made with absolutely zero passion, even the slightest bit of care for the original product, just covering the minimum amount of actual basis to be considered a functional video game, if that. And the thing is, where you can at least give Gollum some points for trying something a bit out of the box, trying an idea that hadn't been shown within his franchise before, this game doesn't even really do anything like it. It doesn't even try. It is a story-driven game that follows the story that already exists, the main story of the series. They aren't even creating their own story beats. Even the promised divergent storylines all line up back on the same beats written by Robert Kirkman literally 20 years ago for the original comic, some of which were of course changed for the show, which is represented in this game, but they took zero risks. They did nothing of actual note. They just put out a really poor interpretation of a highly marketable franchise, and the result, a $50 game, so the same price as Gollum, with peak players on release date of 217. The main reason for it being higher than Skull Island is that Skull Island was at least extremely forward with its failures. Its trailers hid nothing, you knew what you were getting into before you bought the product, whereas this one at least promised an interesting concept, then just didn't deliver on it in the slightest once you actually played it. That said, it's still less than a third of the all-time peak for Gollum, so clearly players knew ahead of time what they should probably expect here. And so we once again have a heavily panned game, barely any players, no actual reason for it to really exist, and it released only a month after Skull Island Rise of Kong. And you want to know the best part? Well, the development studio for this game is mostly unremarkable, mostly responsible for a handful of Karate Kid games with reviews that place them as pretty mediocre in themselves, but the fun part of this, the real kicker, who published this game, well, that would be Game Mill Entertainment, and if they sound familiar, that's because they also produced Skull Island Rise of Kong. And again, I feel it's just far too sweet that they are literally called Game Mill as a company, as they are now notably responsible for helping churn out two of the biggest stinkers of the year with the least amount of passion and effort put into them, two of the worst games that have come out in multiple years. And that is almost impressive in itself, almost as if they are trying their best to get as much negative press as possible, like they are actively going out of their way to make the worst game of the year just to drum up some attentions for themselves, even if it's negative attention. And yet somehow, with this game releasing in late November, with Skull Island Rise of Kong in October, this is still not the worst game to release this year as far as I'm concerned, because that title, without a single shadow of a doubt, goes to our final contender, releasing December 7th, just over a week ago, a game that is as much a scam as any game could ever really be that actually exists, the day before. Now, this game has quite the history to it, so let's actually just go through it chronologically. So we'll start by going back in time to January of 2021, when this game was first revealed to the masses as a shooter, zombie, survival MMO. A massive sprawling world with tons of RPG elements mimicking the style of something like The Division or Destiny, but in a zombie game world, which, yes, zombie games are a bit played out at this moment, but a zombie MMO is something beyond the scope of anything that we've ever truly seen on the topic, and with the way this trailer looked, it actually drummed up a decent amount of excitement that got people genuinely interested to see where this game could go, with eventual promises of things like player housing, or even actual jobs that you could have within the apocalypse that reward you for working. In February of the same year, they showed more gameplay footage and promised a breakthrough for the MMO survival genre in their own words.
Day Before is our greatest game we've ever made at Fantastic, and the real breakthrough for MMO survival genre.
Moving on to April of 2021, we get a full-on 13-minute gameplay trailer showing the world what it's like to exist within it. Driving, shooting, looting, and at this point, it's starting to feel a little bit less MMO-like than it was originally sold as, but still looking like a really promising game. Fast forward a number of months to October 2021, we get another trailer, this time just showing more of the world itself and the way that it looks, the environments, and it looks pretty good. It really blends with the concept well, and it looks like real effort was actually put into this. And then along with the trailer, we also get a release date set of June 21st, 2022, mere months away. Then the developers went silent until May, just weeks before the expected release date, where they show up, pop up to tell us, hey, we know this was supposed to be out soon, but we are completely going to remake the game in a different engine, moving to Unreal Engine 5, and our new release date is March 1st, 2023. Yeah, and so the excited potential players were, of course, willing to wait because they thought the game had looked so good up to that point, it was worth waiting. They thought, hey, maybe this is a good decision. If it makes the game better, then delays will always be accepted in the end. Then came the scary part. 1 month later, the developers, Fantastic, put out a call for, well, volunteers. volunteer game developers, literally putting out an open call for just anyone, to help create the game, with some people supposedly being paid for their work and others simply being offered free codes for the game on release or things like that, which, considering the game was originally slated for a release that same month, brings up quite a lot of questions about their game development strategies. Then the studio again went quiet for months before a new trailer released in January of this year, 2023. By this point, the game had essentially been the most wishlisted game on Steam for months, which is a pretty prestigious spot to be in and pretty much guarantees your game will be a success if it releases anything even remotely close to what it actually promises. Well, here's the trailer they released here. It showed a very different looking game, but with absolutely minimal gameplay this time around, showing none of the hallmarks of its earlier self. Proper gameplay footage was told to us that it would be released not long after, but then the game supposedly had some sort of trademark dispute that led to it disappearing off of Steam entirely, and, well, them not releasing the aforementioned gameplay. A reminder that the game is supposedly releasing a few weeks from that point, and as of that point in time, even moderators in the game's own official Discord server, people they had chosen to moderate it, are then sharing public confusion as to whether or not the game even actually existed at that point. If your own people are turning on you, that's how you know it's getting really bad. That said, the gameplay trailer footage was released, and somehow 2 years after its initial announcement, at this point, the game looked genuinely so much worse in every department than what we were originally shown. An absolute shell of what was promised to us, what was shown to us, and the release date is now up in the air due to the trademark issues. Developers promised there will be a beta so people can actually check out the current state of the game for free though, and then once more they practically disappear until October of this year, giving us a look at a final launch trailer for the game. The beta that they promised, by the way, that never happened. As November then hit, the game is finally re-added to Steam with the issues theoretically solved. They talk about how they've been working on the game for 5 years and say it will release in early access on Steam in early December, with the previously advertised console versions of the game being quote-unquote indefinitely delayed. Then the game released on December 7th. That's the story leading up until this area of time. So what do you think? What do you think happened? Do you think it will have a positive ending? A game that initially drummed up a hell of a lot of excitement because it looked really cool, that then got a bit lost in the sauce of the development cycle to the point of some of their own people weren't even sure if a playable game actually existed. It then had its release date delayed over a year and a half, then came out relatively out of the blue with very little warning. Do you think this saga is going to end positively, with us consumers getting the game that we had hoped for? The potential breath of fresh air that would be a shooter MMO based in a zombie-ridden world?
This is not that story.
No, because what we got is a steaming pile of trash. It's not an MMO in the slightest, it's an extraction shooter game with garbage mechanics, hilarious animations, graphics that don't even look like they're from the same decade as the previous trailers that were given to us, and of course, there is absolutely no MMO components to the game in the slightest. There is a relatively tiny game world for you to exist in, where you just walk around, see maybe one zombie per city block, which is hilariously low density for this style of game. You pick up some loot, then find an exit before going right back in again. There's proximity text chat so you can interact with your fellow players, and the best part of it all, the game is full of ripped assets the developers never even actually made themselves. The results of this? Well, the game was released on December 7th with a $40 price tag, and thanks to all the hype, it drummed up over the years before release, and all the wishlisting that it got, it reached an all-time peak on release of 38,000 players. Yeah, we're talking nearly 50 times as many concurrent players as Gollum ever reached. And watch this decline down to 18,000 on day 2, down to 9,000 on day 3, less than 5,000 on day 5, and then later on that day, December 11th, the game studio shut down completely, removing all support for the game to the point that you literally cannot even buy the game anymore. Announced nearly 3 years ago as being nearly complete, and now here it is at the tail end of 2023. Not at all the game that we were shown ahead of time, and the best guess anyone has as to why is that they just put a game together with the minimal amount of effort, so they actually had something created. So no one could say that they scammed them completely and that there never was a game to begin with. But the thing is, the end result game is still a scam. The game that they've showed us in these trailers a long time ago never existed, or else they would have given it to us, because that game looked way better than this one. This game is not the culmination of 5 years of work, it is the realization that they couldn't make the thing that they had marketed for multiple years, and just sort of kept trying and failing and trying and failing. Who even knows how much effort they actually put in? But in the end, they literally made this game with literal volunteers that they paid to help with free codes for the game, not even actual money. A game which again released on December 7th as a complete trash pile full of other companies' assets and with the most lukewarm gameplay. A zombie game where there are less zombies than goddamn buildings on the skyline in the background of the major city that the game plays out in. And by no means could you ever call this an MMO as it was originally advertised either. And then they literally just stopped selling the game days later. Every person who actually gave the studio money to play this game should be refunded. Without a doubt, it is a joke. I mentioned that the development studio behind Gollum was shut down within a month, and that meant that they probably knew it was going to happen before the game was released. Well, if that's true, what does it say about a company that shuts down 4 days after release and is so self-aware of what they've done that they won't even sell the game anymore after 4 days? Sure, they recouped a little bit of money from the marketing budget by putting it up for sale for a few days, but this clearly isn't about the money, or it would still be up being sold. This is just an absolutely wild story, and it's hard to really even understand how it happened. This wasn't really a cash grab, it's simply a tale of absolute ineptitude, exaggerated promises, and quite literally fake gameplay being used to drum up hype for something they had not actually made. Then they found themselves entirely incapable of making that product, and once again, like the other stories, instead of just admitting that they had made a mistake and giving up, accepting the bad reputation they'd get as a result, they made it even worse by throwing together an absolutely terrible game they probably made in just like 2 months when they realized that this thing was doomed, just so they could technically have something released off of this. Better to be bad game developers than literal liars. I mean, right? After all, if your company is at fault, you can dissolve it 4 days after launch and go create something new and no one will remember you. But if the blame shifts to the people in charge, those people's names are ruined. If they lied, that's a problem. So hey, let's just put something out and then call it a day, I guess. And that's it. What I think is somehow even worse than all 3 other games that we talked about today, somehow the year got progressively worse, but also had some absolutely top tier releases too. It's just such a strange year for video games, one that will be remembered for having some of the best game releases of the last decade, genuinely some extremely solid games, all competing with each other in a similar time frame of release, yet also somehow the same time frame is shared by some of the worst games that we've seen in the modern era. And this is the moment that I understand the concept of balance. In order for us to have truly great video games, there must also be ones on the opposite side of the tracks to even it out, you know? For without the truly bad games, would we even be able to recognize and appreciate it when a masterpiece comes along? Yes, for fuck's sake, yes we would. Stop making absolute garbage games like this. That's it, I'm done.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.